Every startup begins with a belief that something in the world could work better, faster, simpler, more human. But somewhere between the first prototype and the first 1,000 users, many startups lose sight of the most important truth business books quietly repeat across decades. The customer is not an obstacle to overcome, but the reason the company exists at all. User-centric design is not a trend born from modern UX theory. It is the rediscovery of a principle as old as commerce itself. In the early days of a startup, founders often confuse vision with certainty. They fall in love with what they are building. They defend features with passion. They explain friction instead of removing it. Books on entrepreneurship and product design describe this phase with empathy because it is natural. Creation feels personal. But the books also warn that this is where many companies quietly fail. When a startup asks users to adapt to the product instead of adapting the product to users, growth stalls, even if the idea is brilliant. User-centric design begins with humility. It requires founders to accept that intent does not equal experience. What you meant to build is irrelevant to what users actually feel when they use it. Books like The Lean Startup and Inspired emphasize this distinction relentlessly. They teach that startups do not fail because they lack ideas, but because they lack feedback loops. The most successful companies are not those with the strongest opinions, but those with the fastest learning cycles. At the heart of user-centric design is a simple question that many startups avoid because it feels uncomfortable. Where is the user struggling? Not, where is the user wrong? Not, why don't they understand? But where have we made this harder than it needs to be? This question shifts responsibility from the user to the system. And systems, unlike people, can be redesigned. Books that study breakout startups reveal a consistent pattern. Early success often comes not from adding features, but from removing friction, reducing steps, clarifying language, shortening time to value. When products succeed, users rarely describe them as powerful. They describe them as easy. That word easy is deceptive. Easy is not simple to achieve. It requires deep understanding of user behavior, context, and emotional state. Easy is the result of hard thinking, done on behalf of the customer. Another key lesson from user-centric design literature is that users do not want products, they want progress. They are not buying software, platforms, or tools. They are hiring something to solve a problem in their life. This idea, explored in books like Competing Against Luck, reframes design entirely. The startup's job is not to showcase features, but to remove obstacles between the user and their desired outcome. When design focuses on outcomes rather than functionality, priorities become clearer and complexity fades. Startups that truly embrace user-centric design also understand that users are emotional before they are rational. Friction is not just mechanical, it is psychological. Confusion, anxiety, uncertainty, and distrust all slow adoption. Books on behavioral design explain that small signals language, defaults, visual hierarchy carry enormous weight. A single unclear prompt can break trust. A poorly timed request can create resistance. User-centric companies design not just for usability, but for reassurance. Another insight repeated across startup literature is that listening does not mean obeying. User-centric design is not about building everything users ask for. It is about understanding why they ask. Users describe symptoms. Designers diagnose causes. The best founders learn to translate feedback into insight. They distinguish between noise and pattern. This requires discipline, because reacting to every request leads to bloated products. User-centric design is not reactive, it is interpretive. As startups grow, the challenge intensifies. Scale introduces distance. Metrics replace conversations. Dashboards replace stories. Books warn that this is where companies risk losing their user-centric soul. When decisions are driven only by averages and aggregates, edge cases disappear, and edge cases are often where pain hides. The best companies institutionalize empathy. They watch user sessions. They read support tickets. They sit with discomfort. They refuse to let abstraction erase humanity. User-centric design also reshapes internal culture. Teams stop asking, "Can we build this?" and start asking, "Should we?" They stop celebrating output and start measuring impact. Books on product leadership emphasize that this shift is cultural, not cosmetic. It requires incentives aligned with user success. Engineers, designers, and marketers must share ownership of the user experience. Silos kill empathy. Shared responsibility preserves it. One of the most powerful lessons in these books is that user-centric design accelerates growth precisely because it slows assumptions. Startups that rush to scale without understanding users amplify mistakes. Those that pause to listen compound insight. This patience feels risky in competitive markets, but the books show that it is the opposite. Speed without understanding is fragile. Understanding creates momentum that lasts. Perhaps the most counterintuitive insight is that user-centric design is not altruistic, it is pragmatic. Companies that respect users earn trust. Trust lowers acquisition costs. Trust increases retention. Trust turns customers into advocates. The books are clear. Empathy is not charity, it is strategy. And in an era of infinite choice, it may be the only durable advantage left. As these lessons accumulate, a deeper realization emerges. User-centric design is not a department, it is a posture, a way of seeing the business from the outside in rather than the inside out. When startups adopt this posture, decisions simplify, roadmaps clarify, trade-offs become obvious, and growth, when it comes, feels less forced and more earned. And this is where the story begins to deepen. Because once a startup truly accepts that the customer is king, not in slogans, but in systems, the question changes from how do we get users to how do we deserve them? It is at this point that user-centric design stops being a methodology and becomes a philosophy, shaping every interaction, every iteration, and every choice the company makes. And that philosophy begins to express itself most clearly under pressure, when shortcuts are tempting and empathy is costly. And it is precisely here, at the intersection of growth and integrity, that the real test of user-centric design unfolds, revealing whether a startup is merely building a product or building a relationship that can endure, evolving forward with intention and care, like Next. K4 Tom TC Saksh Tenjen Danoi. Evolving forward with intention and care, like a conversation that deepens over time rather than a transaction that ends at checkout. And this is where user-centric design reveals its real power, not in moments of ease, but in moments of tension, when growth pressures collide with human needs. In the second half of this story, the books become very clear about one thing. User-centric design is most valuable when it is hardest to practice, when investors demand faster growth, when competitors copy features aggressively, when metrics tempt teams to optimize for clicks instead of trust. This is the moment where many startups quietly abandon the customer-first mindset, not deliberately, but incrementally. And it is also the moment where the enduring companies separate themselves. Books that study long-lived startups show that user-centric design acts as a stabilizing force during scale. As user numbers grow, complexity grows with them. Edge cases multiply. Support tickets surge. The temptation is to abstract users into segments, cohorts, and averages. Data becomes cleaner, but reality becomes blurrier. The best founders resist this drift. They treat metrics as signals, not substitutes for empathy. They use numbers to ask better questions, not to avoid uncomfortable answers. One of the most important lessons from user-centric literature is that friction always migrates. Remove it in one place, and it often appears somewhere else: pricing, onboarding, support, trust. Companies that truly respect users learn to trace friction across the entire journey, not just within the product. Billing clarity, cancellation ease, honest communication during outages. These moments are rarely celebrated in pitch decks, yet they are where loyalty is earned or lost. Users remember how a company behaves when something goes wrong far more vividly than when everything works. Another deep insight these books highlight is that user-centric design requires moral courage. It often means saying no to growth tactics that technically work but feel wrong. Dark patterns convert well. Aggressive nudges inflate numbers. Hidden complexity reduces churn in the short term. But the books are relentless in showing how these choices erode trust quietly until the brand becomes brittle. User-centric startups choose slower, cleaner growth because they understand that trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. As startups mature, user-centric design also shapes leadership decisions. Roadmaps become less about internal excitement and more about external impact. Teams prioritize problems that matter deeply to users, even if they are not flashy. This discipline prevents bloat. It keeps products coherent, and it creates a sense of internal pride. People know why they are building what they are building. Purpose replaces pressure. Another powerful theme emerges around feedback fatigue. Listening to users does not mean drowning in opinion. Books stress the importance of synthesis. Great user-centric teams develop the skill of pattern recognition. They learn to distinguish between isolated complaints and systemic pain. They avoid the trap of building for the loudest voices while ignoring the silent majority. This balance between empathy and judgment is what turns user input into strategic advantage rather than chaos. Over time, something subtle happens inside user-centric startups. Speed improves not because corners are cut, but because clarity increases. When teams deeply understand their users, decisions require less debate. Trade-offs become obvious. Design choices feel intuitive. The company moves faster precisely because it knows whom it serves and whom it does not. This is the paradox the books return to again and again. Empathy accelerates execution. Eventually, user-centric design extends beyond product into identity. The startup stops asking how to dominate a market and starts asking how to earn a place in people's lives. This shift changes everything. Marketing becomes more honest. Support becomes more human. Policies become more transparent. The company's reputation grows not through noise, but through consistency. Users recommend not because they are incentivized, but because they feel respected. And this is the quiet conclusion the books lead toward. The customer is king, not because the customer is always right, but because the customer is always human. Startups that remember this build products that fit into real lives, not idealized use cases. They grow not by forcing adoption, but by removing reasons for resistance. They endure not by chasing trends, but by honoring trust. If this perspective resonated with you, pause and ask a simple question. Where in your product or business are you asking users to work harder than you are? That answer is your next design opportunity. Share that reflection. And if you want to keep exploring how empathy, integrity, and clarity quietly outperform hype in the startup world, stay connected. Subscribe, follow, and return. Because in the long run, the companies that win are not the loudest or the fastest, but the ones that never forget who they are building for.